Hola, buenos días en América Latina. Buenas tardes en Europa.
Good morning, Latin America. Good afternoon, Europe. Logistics. Notice, although the session will be mostly in Spanish, we will have some interventions in English, so you will be able to listen to the simultaneous interpretation that you will get if you click on the bottom bar.
Please note that the session will be conducted mainly in Spanish, and for this we have simultaneous translation. You can access the translation in the lower right corner of your screen. Bienvenidos todos a nuestra segunda sesión de...
Welcome everybody to our second session of the Decarbonizing Transport in Latin America and the Caribbean initiative. In this case, this session will be focused on the Mexico City. On behalf of the Division of Transport of IADB and the ITF, we're very thankful for you being here. Basically, this event will be divided into three. Initially, we will have some welcome remarks from our representative of the bank in Mexico and also by the Undersecretary of Mobility. Then we will move on to a technical session where ITF will provide us with some context and the main findings and recommendations of everything that was done in Mexico City. And lastly, we will have a panel discussion in which we will talk about these findings, these recommendations, and panel members will be asked certain specific questions, perhaps related to how to move on with this initiative. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Roberto Manrique. Roberto Manrique, as I said, is a representative of the bank in Mexico. He's an economist from the University of Wayne in Chicago. He also had a PhD there, and Roberto has been very successful at the IADB. He's an expert structuring loan operations. He's also been a consultant to the vice presidency and the presidency of the bank. I want to highlight something. Before becoming part of the ministerial representative, he led the special group for the modernization of the environmental and social policies of the IADB, which was an intense position. So I think that these initiatives, this climate change and decarbonization initiative, are close to Roberto's heart. So without further ado, Roberto, it is a pleasure for us to see you, and here you have the floor. Can you hear me? Great. Ernesto, thank you for your kind words and your beautiful presentation introduction. I wanted to say hi to Rodrigo Diaz, the Undersecretary of Mobility of Mexico City, our colleagues from ITF, the IADB, and everyone in general. Good morning and afternoon to all of you.
Simultaneous translation. Tengo el enorme placer, el gusto.
It is a huge honor for me to welcome you to this virtual workshop and session in which I will present the specific results for Mexico City of the regional initiative on decarbonizing urban transport in Latin America and the Caribbean. This amazing initiative is the result of a technical cooperation between the IADB as a regional public good mode, and it tries to decarbonize transport within this program of the ITF. This ITF program promotes carbon neutral more urban mobility to mitigate the effects of climate change. As a representative of the IADB's group in Mexico, I would like to celebrate the fact that Mexico City participated in this project, and also I want to celebrate the close cooperation that we had between the Mobility and Environment Secretariats, the ITF, and the IADB. During these 3 years of intense work and joint work as well, we analyzed the policies and trends of the city, the travel information, data on air quality, and the most effective means to decarbonize urban transport, something that, as Ernesto said, is very close to my heart, and not only my heart, but also the heart of our IADB's colleagues, I would like to highlight how this platform of dialogue and knowledge transfer has evolved. Conversations went beyond CO2 emissions and air quality and touched upon other essential topics like informality, subsidies to transport, and gender equality. We believe and trust that the different activities that we carried out in this context and this initiative have contributed to strengthen strategic planning in terms of mobility and transport of the city. And we are more than convinced that the experiences of Mexico City have enriched the city planning of Bogotá and Buenos Aires. This is what this exchange is about. This is an exchange of knowledge that we want to keep promoting from the IADB group. We want to put Mexico's best international practice at service and to promote throughout the region everything that Mexico has to or can contribute with. This has all happened in a very tough time for all of us, but this is a window of opportunity as well. Over a year ago, right before the COVID-19 pandemic started, transport accounted for 25% of national GHG emissions. It was highly linked to the development of and the outbreak of air quality diseases. Nowadays, our countries and our cities have in their economic recovery processes a unique opportunity to change the road towards a sustainable mobility with neutral emissions of GHG. We hope that all the experiences and the knowledge that have been exchanged make the most of this opportunity to innovate, but also to deal with existing market failures, to introduce efficiencies in current systems, to improve the quality of transport services, and of course, to reduce emissions that make it possible to comply with the Paris Agreement, of course, finding a balance between regulations and incentives. I would also like to thank once again the groups and the teams of the Mobility Secretariat, the Environmental Secretariat of the City of Mexico. Their participation was fundamental to consolidate and progress with this initiative. Also, I would like to thank particularly the ITF and the IADB's teams because of thanks to their dedicated effort to present and to reach these products and outcomes that we will present today. From the IADB, we're excited to continue to work with Mexico City and to support their initiatives to progress and move forward towards an urban, sustainable, healthy, and carbon neutral service that will improve the lives of Mexican citizens and that will set a precedent, a successful precedent for other cities in the country and throughout the world. Thank you so much, and I wish you a great, fruitful session. Thank you, Roberto, for your words, and thank you for supporting us in organizing this event. We will now hear Rodrigo Diaz. He will say a few words, and before I want to introduce Rodrigo, I would also like to thank once again for 3 years of collaboration. Rodrigo was the host of one of our sessions a couple of years ago in Mexico City. He carried out visits, he gave us his offices, and his team was always available to meet our needs. So Rodrigo, thank you so much again. Rodrigo, as we know, he's the Undersecretary of Planning, Policies, and Regulation of the Environmental Secretariat of Mexico City. He is an architect and he has a master's degree in urban planning from MIT. He has vast experience both in Chile, where he was born, and in Mexico, where he not only has worked in the Mobility Secretariat, but also in CETES in Mexico as a senior expert, and also he has worked in the Applied Research and Development Group. As we all know, Rodrigo is a cyclist, he's a blogger, he walks a lot, and so he's got great opinions. I don't know how to say this, but he's not shy to share his mind. And that has made very successful exchanges with all cities. Without further ado, Rodrigo, you have the floor. Hello, Ernesto. Good morning. Good day to you all. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this session. I think that after these 2 years working jointly with the ITF and after 2 years working in the city government, there is a convinced idea that transport decarbonization is not an option. We are, quote unquote, condemned to it. The revolution of urban transport, we could say that it will be decarbonized or it will not be. We need to move forward towards it. But what's the way to go? Well, that is up to every city according to their own financial, technical, geographical, organizational, institutional realities. Models are very different, and that is why we see certain differences between cities that at first sight are large cities like Bogotá, Mexico City, and Buenos Aires. Their economic realities are somewhat similar. We are from the same region, and still the paths that we have taken in this process of decarbonizing our mobility systems can be very different. To give you a concrete example, in the case of Mexico City, we really dedicated our efforts to strengthen what we used to have. We had a trolley bus network. We had almost 500 kilometers of these roads. Then that system was disassembled. Then when we used to have 40% of that, of what we used to have. So when we took over, our first reaction was, we need to put some electrical buses. And we said, but we have the catenaria, we have this system, this old technology knowledge. And yes, perhaps it might not be as beautiful and good looking as electrical buses, but we could implement it quicker. And now we have 193 new units with 50 articulated ones. This is the road we decided to take. It's not that Buenos Aires and Bogotá should do the same. It was what we decided to do because we believe that those were our advantages at the moment. But we also learned from other reality. We analyzed cable systems and we visited the Bogotá cable system. It was an inspiration for us as well for the first cable line that we have in Mexico City. We have a small segment in the Cuautepec section area. That is how we started sharing our experiences and always trying to find our own way. Ernesto said this, and I mentioned this before. When we did these workshops in 2019, it was a pre-COVID session, right? COVID has been an earthquake for good and for bad. The whole scenario of mobility has changed, and we need to be smart enough to make the most of this moment. It is true that COVID, in economic, financial terms, it has been a disaster. And this will probably delay some investments that we had planned in terms of clean mobility, carbon low mobility. But it also is coupled with other positive aspects that we need to incorporate. And I yesterday mentioned telework in particular. Telework is not an ideal situation. It might have some complications, we know. But from the mobility perspective, if we can make the most of it, it has huge gains and advantages. I mean, we're having this conference virtually. We have people in Europe, in the US, in Mexico, and it can be done with virtually zero cost. And of course, it doesn't have the wealth and the richness of a place in particular. It doesn't have the wealth and the richness of meeting people for coffee during a break. We cannot see the BRT in Buenos Aires, the cable system in Bogotá. We cannot do that virtually, but we can exchange information and experiences. And I think that if we can handle demand side strategies, if we manage hourly flexibility, then we can have a significant base for mobility in order to reduce our carbon footprint. Perhaps in these next few years, we will not achieve our fleet renewal, but we will achieve advantages and gains in terms of reconfiguring trips and journeys. We have many new opportunities based on what we have worked with ITF and IADB. We have been provided with valuable tools to assess our public policies. So for us, it is an honor to be able to share this message and perhaps open a new door for a new stage of work. Thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo. I think that last sentence you talked about a new stage of cooperation. I think that would be spectacular. As you said, and Roberto mentioned before, and it was also mentioned yesterday, the COVID situation has affected us all. When we began working with this, we never thought we would be working from home for a year. We've adapted, though, to it, and everyone has highlighted the opportunities that this has given us to think differently and the challenges, of course. So I would deeply want to thank you for all your support, the time you've dedicated, your team has dedicated. Thank you so much for that. And it's a pleasure for us to hear that you have found this beneficial and that the exchange of experiences has been fruitful for the city of Mexico, and we're ready to get into a new stage. Could I add something else, Ernesto? I've been the visible face of the Secretariat, but I would also like to highlight the role of Álvaro Madrigal, who has been doing the grunt technical work with his team and his ITF team. And I would really want to thank him because he has been at the heart and the core of everything of the technical job. Thank you, Rodrigo. And thank you all. And thank you, Álvaro, particularly, and all the team that you have there. So let's move on to the second part of this working session. We will hear the ITF team talk about the context of all the different activities that were done in Mexico City and what are the main findings and recommendations. I will do a very brief introduction of the ITF team. We have Stephen Perkins. Stephen Perkins, I will switch to English now.
And leads the Transport Research Center at the ITF. Also in the team, we have Elizabeth Winchell, and she leads the policy analysis team at the ITF in Paris. And she's the manager for this decarbonization transport initiative in Latin America and the Caribbean, which we've been working together for the past 3 years. And last but not least, from this core team, we have Dimitrios Papayanou, who's a transport modeler and analysis in the quantitative policy analysis and foresight team. Dimitrios, as you all know, has been in charge of the model, and he's also in charge of doing several similar models within ITF. And with that, please, ITF team, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernesto, for that introduction. And I'll kick off from the ITF side with a quick overview of where we see the policy context on the ground, and then hand over to Elizabeth and Demetrius to talk about the core of the work that we did on the modeling and the modeling tool. And just before I start, I'd just like to thank Rodrigo and your team, Alvaro, everybody else, for your very warm and strong support in getting this project done. Obviously, we could not have done it without you, and we were very happy to have worked so closely with you. And if only the project wasn't finished and we could carry on that. And also, obviously, it would be so much better to be with you in Mexico City, but at least telework and Zoom is keeping us going. So if we can have the next slide. Demetrius is in control of the slide. Sorry, the slide before. Yeah, I'm looking at the wrong screen. Yep. Okay, so just to start off with the context of what we were looking at in this project, we looked at the entire metropolitan area of the Valle de Mexico, but we focused on the policies of the city itself, Semovi and Sedema, so representing 9 million of the 21 million people in the region as a whole. Of course, there are a number of regional commissions that have been established over the years, but these have been largely ineffective in coordinating mobility policy or land use planning. The one exception is the Environment Commission, CAME, which has been quite effective in coordinating air pollution policy across the region. Next slide. So, of course, the big priority for the government overall is addressing the profound inequalities in the region. And the mobility policy is really faced with a very difficult task to address that and to connect people in the lower income areas, right across the metropolitan area and around the periphery of Mexico City itself, with jobs which are located mainly in the center and in the wealthier parts of the city. And the bulk of that transport connecting people to jobs is carried out by public transport. And what's really noticeable about Mexico City is that the bulk of that, over 55%, is carried on the loosely regulated microbuses. And that stands out quite different from the situation in Bogotá or Buenos Aires. And the other big difference is the extremely high share of cycling in Bogotá, 3 times what it is in Mexico City at the moment. So the other big characteristic of the region on the next slide is congestion and crowding is severe in the peak across much of the region. On the roads, expansion of the express road network in recent decades has tended to induce traffic as much as relieve congestion. And there's also severe crowding on the microbuses, where licensing incentivizes overloading and of keeping passengers waiting to load the vehicles fully before they leave. And there's also severe crowding on some of the BRT and metro lines in the peak. The microbuses cover a much larger area than any of the other modes, the orange lines on the map, much larger than the metro or the BRT, despite the metro system being the busiest in the whole of Latin America. So really the quality of microbus service determines the overall quality of the mobility system as a whole. And BRT has been used successfully to reconfigure some of the key bus corridors, and it's added 25% capacity to what the metro can carry. So the second big factor determining the overall quality of the transit system is the crowding in the metro and the BRT system. Of course, there are also some high quality transport modes as well, the city buses and the trolley buses. And we've seen, as Rodrigo said, a very significant investment in new vehicles in the trolley buses, with more to come with new diesel buses. But these modes really only account for 2% of the trips at the moment. There's some of the newer BRT lines as well, which offer very high quality services. But improvement through innovation in the dominant micromobility mode is going to be critical to the overall quality of the transit system across the area. And this includes through app-based reservation and route planning systems, which have been brought in by private entrants. But also Somovi is innovating with GPS tracking to monitor compliance with licensed routes. And this could be developed to monitor the frequency of service and the delays, and in that way start to regulate the quality of service of the microbuses. And it would be very interesting to hear in the discussion how that project is progressing and how far you've got. So improving the quality of service on the microbuses every way possible is going to be critical to retaining users and to avoiding a shift to motorcycles and to second-hand used vehicles. If we look at the CO2 emissions from the road modes, we see just how clear it is. Clearly, it is important to keep people on the public transport and to shift them out of cars and motorcycles to the much more carbon efficient public transport modes. And of course, to cycling and other micromobility whose emissions are too small to even show up on this graph. The cycling story has been very successful in Mexico City during the COVID crisis. After a slower start in Bogotá, there's been some really significant reallocation of space made, including on one of the key north-south axes pictured in this car used by BRT and cars, and now by bicycles in a separated lane as well. And hopefully this can become a permanent reallocation. And work to accelerate the expansion of Somovi's plans for infrastructure, safe cycling infrastructure across the city. And the maps shows just how much has been achieved so far, with good coverage in the central part of the city with designated cycleways and of course the EcoBC shared bike system. And we'd urge more rapid expansion than planned of the shared bike service areas. And that's including for the dockless bikes and for dockless e-bike systems, with DESBA, the one operator that's still working at the moment. And then as we enter into COVID recovery, facilitate a return of more e-bike operators and e-scooter operators through modified regulation with open service areas, dynamic fleet caps, and a license fee based on mobility policy rather than on rent. So all of this fits extremely well into the long-standing priorities of Somovi to achieve a hierarchy where pedestrians and cycling comes very clearly at the top, and to treat the different modes in regulatory terms that way. I think the one missing part of this sustainable urban mobility approach is integrated land use and transport planning. And this really needs urgent reform. It goes beyond Somovi's competences, of course, but the CAM-E, the Regional Environment Commission, might be brought in to provide the necessary region-wide dimension to that kind of integrated planning. The other big part of decarbonization policy across the OECD is, of course, electrification. In Mexico City, the federal policy towards energy supply is weak on decarbonizing electricity production. So I guess here more than anywhere in the OECD, electrification should be seen as a precursor for decarbonizing transportation in the longer term. And this just underlines again the importance of modal shift to public transport and non-motorized mobility as the core, along with containing demand through stronger land use planning controls and more traffic demand management instruments. And all of these measures are very central to the social inequality agenda. So there are a lot of synergies available. The tools employed by the city to date to mitigate CO2 emissions are most importantly the vehicle inspection and emissions testing system run by SEDEMA, which really has world-class testing and monitoring systems in place in terms of some of the technology that's been used. The federal light duty efficiency standards have also been important, but for the future, it's really Somovi's strategic mobility plan that's going to determine the way emissions develop. So the plan is in 3 parts, starting with a better integrated public transport, accompanied by a 5% increase in the public transport infrastructure, assuming we can get the funding, and a 15% increase in the bike network. It also includes improvement with investment in the trolley buses that we've seen, and a redesign, if we can go to the next slide, of some of the transfer stations and some of the most crowded BRT stations, and protection of more bus lanes across the city. And then the third part of the plan is to protect users more effectively with investments in safe walking and cycling, a new driver license penalty point system, and a focus on gender equality through a policy to be developed, focusing on anti-harassment measures. And of course, there's a lot of work that's been done already between Mexico City and the IDB, and building on that work should provide the basis for that policy. So to cut to the conclusion, all of these measures in the plan are clearly the right ones, and with our analysis, the ones to develop further, and the ones that have been incorporated in the baseline of the modeling that Demetrius and Elizabeth will talk about. But really, to meet the climate goals that have been set internationally and the ambition for Mexico, what basically needs to be done is a lot more of the same in the same policy directions. That means extending public transport infrastructure further, including into the state of Mexico, raising the quality of public transport faster than the rate at which incomes rise, and more proactively managing demand for car use. This will, of course, require more money, as Rodrigo said yesterday. The elephant in the room is really the funding that's going to be available to do this. So our report does look into some of the options that might be possible to support scaling up of decarbonisation, starting with limiting commercial property development in line with the capacity of public transport to serve the sites that are being developed. Notoriously, BRT Line 1 has been outstripped with the development of office capacity along its line. Review of, and secure additional funding for public transport. And there's an option from betterment charges, which are actually provided for under existing law in Mexico, and linking this to granting a planning permission. Now, if the new source of funding does not materialize and there's no additional funding from the federal government and no additional powers granted to the city to raise its own tax revenues, really there's going to need to be a review of public transport tariffs and a look at targeting subsidies to the public transport system more effectively to support low-income users rather than having flat, low fares. And then also support public, private as well as public sector initiatives to improve the microbus service, simply because the scale of improvement that's needed requires private initiative as well as public initiative. And then finally, one short-term option that could deliver quickly is to reduce speed limits across the area, not only to improve safety, but also to smooth traffic flow and reduce emissions. And this can be quite effective. So I'll stop there, leaving Rodrigo to come back with how to go about tackling the really difficult aspect of getting more resources. And maybe for us all, a follow-up collaboration with IDB lead with the state of Mexico to repeat this work and to get the whole region fully engaged. So I'll stop there and hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Steve. So I will give you now an overview of the scenarios that we have defined in the context of this project with the city authority. For those who could not join the first session yesterday, just a quick recap that one of the main objectives of this project was to develop strategic transport and CO2 emission modeling tools for each of the case study cities. So we also did this in the case of Mexico City. The tool will be handed over next week. For providing the city authorities with an example and providing you, the audience, with example outputs of this model and show you what this model can do, we had technical sessions with each of the cities where we asked them to please provide us with scenario definitions that we could test in the modeling tools. So each of the cities did this. These scenarios are not very specifically in line with any specific policy plan that may exist. It is more like it was more like a trial and error session, so to say, with the city authorities, so that they test a bit what is feasible and see what the measures that they're currently envisioning where they will get them to in terms of CO2 emissions reductions. In the case of Mexico City, you see here the geographic scope. So the geographic scope, also as Steve said just before, is much larger than the city of Mexico City itself. It is the metropolitan zone of the Valley of Mexico. For the context of this work, we have split this geographic area into 30 zones. So basically all the policy measures that you can test in this tool, you can define either on the zone level, on a citywide level, or in terms of infrastructure developments, you can define exactly, okay, a new BRT line, for example, should go from this zone to that zone, and then we could retrace this, so to say, in our modeling tool to make sure that this new transport corridor can then be properly reflected in the tool. So now to the definition of the baseline scenario. What wanted the cities to test in this baseline scenario, and what was the definition of the scenario against which they wanted to then compare more ambitious policy scenario against. This baseline scenario includes the stated plans and ambitions of the current administration. The measures that are included in the baseline scenario focus on the short term and do not have many specifics on the longer term. So most measures that we saw in this baseline scenario rather reach to 2030, but not to the 2050 timeframe. In terms of infrastructure developments, there is a set of public transport enhancements in terms of BRT, metro, cable car, and trolleybus. There's also improvements foreseen for non-motorized transport in terms of walking and cycling infrastructure. However, this mainly refer to improvements in the city center only. With regards to restriction policies and new modes, it is assumed that the city center becomes a full low emission zone for cars, and also that a new on-demand public transport mode emerges. So basically, this would be a new service that is based on minibuses. In terms of fleet electrification, the uptake of clean vehicles, it is assumed that electric car sales make around 20% in the year 2050, and that the public transport fleet first goes to the use of LPG or CNG before they then actually go electric later on. Now, in comparison to this, the alternative scenario, I put in here in bold the differences to the baseline scenario. So you see the additional ambition that was assumed for this alternative scenario that we tested. Basically, the city wanted to test additional public transport services, also the non-motorized measures, the measures that target non-motorized journeys are not only now in the city center, but also in the whole state of Mexico. Then there is still this low emission zone in the city center. However, also parking prices grow, and there is a fair integration across the whole public transport system to make public transport journeys much smoother. Also, it is assumed in this scenario that teleworking becomes much more the norm, especially now after the pandemic. Also, it is assumed that the clean vehicle sales increase compared to the baseline scenario. Namely, we have a 50% share by 2050, and also the public transport fleet is assumed to electrify much faster and more intensely than in the baseline scenario. So this just a quick overview of what was done. I will now hand over to my colleague Dimitrios, who was behind the whole model development, before I then finish off with some recommendations and conclusions.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And hello to everyone from my side. I will briefly present some of the results that come out from this modeling tool. At first, here we see the number of trips happening in the entire study area in the metropolitan area of the Valley of Mexico, and we can see that there is growth expected. Growth is expected in both scenarios. In the baseline, this growth is estimated to go by as much as 50% for year 2050. However, in the alternative scenario, we see that this growth is contained. The main reason behind that is teleworking. It is assumed that a significant part of people who can telework will telework. So obviously this will have a reduction in the number of trips that are done, but also it will have other effects such as the distance on trips. This is something we will see later on. Now, the trips will grow, but how will they grow? So here on this slide, you can see what is the mode balance in terms of trips in Mexico City. You can see that the main mode used, as Steve mentioned, is public transport, but then there are a lot of walking trips. And actually, private car, at least for the base year, has comparatively to the others in trip numbers, a small share, but we need to remember that this city is a massive global metropolis, which has a huge number of car trips. So even this 17% is enough to produce congestion levels and many other issues. So the policies that are included in this scenario do reduce the vehicle dependency in the short term, but the lack of long-term strategies that Elizabeth mentioned actually have a bounce back. So at the end of the study period 2050, we do see a return to similar numbers with the base year, at least when it comes to private vehicles. The one thing that is making the difference in this case is this new added service, which is the minibuses that are on demand. This is a new concept of public transportation, of how people move. People order a ride coming to their home, a minibus comes and would take you to your destination directly. So this proves to be an attractive service which draws a number of trips, and these trips are, as you can see, mostly drawn by conventional public transport or walking trips. Of course, we cannot know exactly what these trips are replacing, but comparing the base year and 2050, this is the conclusion that comes out of it. Now, looking at the alternative scenario, we see actually the trend is a bit different, favors more sustainable modes, let's say. So as you can see, there is a much lower share of private car trips, and obviously a role to that is teleworking. So as more people telework, there is a less need for private vehicle trips. More trips could happen by non-motorized modes, for example. However, the different policies that are implemented, including the low emission zone, the parking pricing increases, allow conventional public transport to maintain its role in the city. And yet again, we do have a significant share, about 1 in 10 trips would be done by this new minibuses mode. And from the insights that we get is that a lot of those trips replace private car trips, as now it is harder to get in the city center. Many trips could happen by this mode, which is flexible and fast enough to do that. Now, the model itself allows us to put measures, as Elizabeth mentioned, at different levels. And sometimes the impact of these measures is more pronounced locally. And here, for example, I'm showing you some maps which shows the bike usage in the zones, in the different zones of the study area. So each scenario has different implementation of different measures that can affect cycling, such as cycling infrastructure or expanding the EcoBC program. So you can see in the baseline, there is a number of zones which are all within the city of Mexico that do have an increase in bike usage, and this comes partly as a result of these measures. In the other zones, you see that the share remains the same or even slightly reduces. Now, contrasting to that, in the alternative scenario, where these measures are put in place in more zones, we see that actually more zones do benefit by these measures and do have an increased usage of cycling. And similar effects can be seen also for other modes. For example, if you have modes that restrict car usage in a zone, then you see a reduction in car usage starting or ending in that zone. Now, evaluating activity in terms of trips gives you some interesting insights, but it disregards the impact of distance. So naturally, motorized modes, such as private car or public transport, are usually used for longer trips. So when we are evaluating transport activity in passenger kilometers, these modes are more important, and non-motorized modes, and especially walking, become less important. If you remember, walking was responsible for about 30% of trips. And when it comes to passenger kilometers, its share drops down to about 2 to 3%. In 2017, the most important modes in terms of passenger kilometer were, of course, public transport, which served 2 out of 3 passenger kilometers traveled in the city, and private car also had an increased importance at about 20%, 1 out of 5. When we look in the future in the two scenarios, we can see that activity overall grows more in the baseline scenario, which comes in line with the trips compared to the alternative scenario. But we also see that in the baseline scenario, the relative importance, the relative shares of the modes remains roughly the same. Of course, we do have the introduction of the new shared minibus on demand, and they do take a part of this demand, but the shares remain the same. In the alternative scenario, in contrast, as I said, the growth is lower, but at the same time, we do see an increase in public transport usage, even in PKM, and an actual reduction in private car usage, and even in absolute numbers. Now, within public transport, because obviously there are different modes, the model allows us to see how the use between the modes shifts as new infrastructure is put in place. So as there are many new infrastructure prioritizing mainly on metro, BRT, and cable car systems, they do replace bus usage, especially when they're put in place. And of course, the new on-demand system also plays a role to that. As bus trips are a prime target for substitution. Now, translating that into emissions, we can see that emissions overall are likely to reduce in both scenarios. We do see a similar short-term reduction, which follows the planned policy developments that we mentioned before. However, when we look in the long term, in the baseline scenario, it shows that the reduction actually stops and even bounces back a bit. And this shows the importance of long-term planning, even if this planning is talking to 20 years or 30 years in the future. And this is evident in the alternative scenario, which of course it's further boosted by the vehicle fleet targets that are set for the two scenarios. And talking about vehicle fleet targets, here we have we can see how the vehicle fleets will evolve in the two scenarios based on the inputs provided. Now, on the baseline scenario, we actually have an increase in the absolute number of cars. They are expected to grow by almost 50% to cover the increased demand. That is for private vehicles, so for private cars. There will be several cars that will be low emission, that will be electric or hybrid, but still the majority will remain conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. In terms of public transport now, that is not on the graph here, we do have a shift away from diesel, but we are still, the fleet will not still be fully electrified in this scenario. We will still have a use of hybrid buses, hybrid diesel buses, and natural gas buses, along, of course, with a significant share that's electrified. Now, in the alternative, which we actually see there is a reduction in the fleet is projected to have a reduction in the fleet. We do have a significant share of vehicles that is electric. I remind you that the sales target for 2050 is 50% for electric vehicles. Of course, this does not mean that 50% of the fleet is electric, but it's something that should happen shortly in the future. And obviously, the reduced number of vehicles follows the reduced demand. This is a component of the model which doesn't necessarily follow reality, as people will usually buy cars regardless of if their transport priorities change, they might still buy a car. Now, regarding on the public transport fleet, we actually see that we actually observe from the model that the majority of the fleet is zero emission. This is because electrification starts earlier, and by 2050, we do have most of the buses used in the fleet be electric. There is a small share that still relies on hybrid and diesel, but that is for the routes where electric buses are not viable. And with that, I will pass the floor back to Elizabeth to talk a bit about some conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you. Yes. So based on these scenario results and what comes out of the model, we can obviously derive some conclusions and also recommendations. And you will see these reflect also partly the things that Steve has already said before in his policy assessment. So it's very congruent, so to say, what comes out of pure policy analysis, and then combining this also with the quantitative evidence, so to say, that comes out of the modeling work. So with regards to teleworking, it shows that it does create an opportunity for wider decentralization policies. So this is obviously beneficial in order to reduce overall passenger kilometers and travel distances, especially if this can be combined with mixed land use development and the creation of local centers to really reduce the flows that go in and out of the city center. In terms of public transport, well, the modeling shows that the continuous investments in infrastructure to enhance and extend the system are very helpful, more so obviously in the alternative scenario where they are intensified. However, we think there is a certain potential that is missed because the support is a bit missing on the other side, where you would need to put measures and policies in place that penalize the car use maybe even further. Obviously, this should always be, let's say, happening in parallel to providing the adequate alternatives for travel users. On the side of this new public transport mode that I had mentioned, on-demand public transport served by minibuses, We think this is a solution that has high potential and that can definitely improve the quality of public transport services, especially where it can extend the current existing services to the areas that are currently very poorly covered only or not covered even at all. If you go to the next slide, please. In terms of cycling, we think there's a great potential, and this can be also further boosted by the infrastructure development. You can clearly see the difference between the baseline and the alternative scenario. So it does make a difference what you do here. The city could consider to create an even safer environment to also encourage women to cycle more. This is something that Dimitrios hasn't mentioned, but actually we do have the option in the model also to separate to look at women and male behavior separately, and we can see that the cycling uptake is definitely not as high for women as it is for men, and this could be improved further. In terms of the CO2 emissions results, well, we could see that, thankfully, so to say, the projected growth can be decoupled from CO2 emissions growth. So CO2 emissions are actually on a descending trajectory, thanks to the policies that are planned. And we think that, or it is clear that much of these policies are actually related, or much of this outcome is actually related to the assumed uptake of clean vehicles. So which leads me already to the next conclusion and recommendation, is that this clean vehicle uptake is definitely essential, also as Steve has said before, and a lot of the CO2 emission reductions will rely on the uptake of clean vehicles. So the city should really do a lot in order to make sure that the targets here that are set, so assumed in the scenarios, are really met and can hopefully even be intensified. And we would encourage you to definitely target first the public fleet to make sure that the public fleet can transition to clean vehicles as fast as possible. But also, obviously, do not forget the private fleet. So whenever you think it is justified that people still do need to buy their own car, it should really be made sure that this is electric as soon as possible to avoid too much of a delay in terms of the fleet renewal over time. With this, I have come to the end of presenting the work that the ITF has done in the context of this project for Mexico City. Obviously, just a brief overview, and there will be many more insights to come once the respective reports are actually published. I want to take the occasion now to also thank on a working level, so to say, Alvaro, who is here, I think, because the collaboration with him has been really great. And I know that Dimitrios and Alvaro have been in close contact all along the project to be sure that all the data and all the questions we had were actually answered, so we could develop this model and make it as specific to Mexico as possible. Thank you very much. With this, I would like to hand the word back to Ernesto. And I think Dimitrios will show a slide that now introduces the members of the panel discussion that will now be introduced by Ernesto. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Dimitrios. Thank you, Steve. Ahora iniciaremos la
We'll now begin with the third part of the meeting. This will be a panel in which we will discuss what ITF has presented, some trends, results, outcomes, and we will perhaps lead the debate with some of the questions that we included in the agenda. We will have the following paneling members coming from the Undersecretary of Mobility, the Secretariat of Environment, and Bernardo Baranda as well. I will introduce Bernardo Baranda. He is the Mexican Director of the Mexican Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. He consults on sustainable projects and sustainable mobility of people. Bernardo has a master's degree in transport engineering from Delft, Holland, and another master's degree in administration. Bernardo has been part of some of the sessions and has been a part of this initiative. So welcome, Bernardo, again. We will hear Oscar Vasquez. He is the General Director of Climate Change at the Secretariat of Environment of the Government of Mexico City. He's a physicist, engineer, and he has a master's degree in engineering and energy. One of his main roles is to assess and participate in policy consultancy for climate change in Mexico City to coordinate institutional strategies. I think that the debate with Oscar will be super interesting. Finally, we will also hear Rodrigo Diaz and Álvaro Madrigal, who, as Elizabeth mentioned, has been an enormous part of this initiative. He has close interaction with Demetrius. Álvaro is the advisor to the Secretariat of Mobility in the City of Mexico, and from the public and private sector, he has worked with urban demographics, population projections, and residential projects. He included and worked on daily mobility. I would first like to start this panel by talking about the conditions, as Rodrigo mentioned when he spoke first. Conditions are very specific for every city, and even when we chose for these initiatives certain cities that are similar, like Bogotá and Mexico, a little bit less Buenos Aires, but every city is particular and specific. So my first question for the panel would be, which do you think are the realistic conditions nowadays in a post-COVID era, in our reality, to leverage measures and scenarios that could help achieve the city's climate ambitions for 2050? What are the realistic conditions? And as part of that question, what is your opinion in terms of the barriers in the Mexico City that would endanger the implementation or the success of these conditions? Perhaps the best thing to do to open this panel, we could hear Rodrigo first. You mentioned this at first, but perhaps you could go deep into which do you think these realistic conditions would be nowadays, and what are the main barriers that endanger the implementation of the goals towards 2050? Rodrigo, you have the floor.
I will be very brief because I don't want to monopolize the opinion here, but the realistic conditions also defining the barriers. First, opportunity. The opportunity is that the city has a model breakdown that is very favorable. If we compare 2007 versus 2017, they are practically the same because cars and bicycles are only 1/3 of the motorized trips in the city, and that is good. This is why I believe that our goal should be to maintain these proportions in terms of modes. Changing it would be very hard, except maybe if we could have more bicycles, that could change the landscape. That would be very favorable. Then, unfavorable elements. Without a doubt, of course, one of the most unfavorable things at the administration level is that we have a 22 million people city. We have the city of Mexico, Mexico City, and the state of Mexico. But these two have different organizations, different administrations, and coordination between the two is very difficult. And this is different compared to what we've seen in Buenos Aires or in Bogotá. In Buenos Aires, the transport system, the public transport system is controlled by the federal government, and that makes things easier. And in the case of Bogotá, Bogotá's mayor covers 90% of it. And it's not the case in Mexico City, where clearly we have an administrative division that makes implementation of things quite difficult. There are important details, as Elizabeth mentioned, in financial terms. And when you have financial problems for many years, it is hard to catch up. And I don't like to talk about subsidies. I'd rather say funding. So we have gaps in terms of funding that make it hard to have fleet renovations. Therefore, when we have these type of problems for a long time with no funds, things become harder and harder. Clearly, there is an issue here that we need to mention, which is that one of our great challenges was the fragmentation of the public transport system, especially of the services that are under license or concession, where we have many operators. So the problem is no longer technical, but social and political. How can we articulate all those groups that are organized here with no credit capacity whatsoever? We've tried to formalize them as with the trolley buses, but the process is very slow and very tiring in terms of negotiation. So at the macro level, I think that those are the great challenges. And I do not want to talk about the micro issues, but I think that that is my perspective in terms of the main obstacles to keep on moving for the decarbonizing process. Thank you, Rodrigo. Alvaro, welcome to the panel and welcome. And once again, thank you for all the support. I know that you've been there behind the scenes. And I don't know if you can say something about the Secretariat of Mobility in terms of the obstacles that we experienced today. Well, thank you for inviting me. And this is an amazing work by the IGB and the ITF. And adding to what Rodrigo said, I think that pedestrian mobility is receiving more potential in the COVID era as telework, and especially with different working schedules. And this was mentioned by the undersecretary yesterday. But I would like to say that the hours, the peak hours have changed now with this new scenario, and this could bring along maybe attractive to some transport modes that probably before were avoided due to agglomerations. But also we have financial challenges in terms of infrastructure and change of public transport fleet and also private transport fleet. So then the challenge would also be to guarantee maybe through time schemes or in some sort of way, but the key point there is to maintain the public transport users in the public transport system and not to send them or to see them in private transport, because private transport accounts only for 20% of the trips in the metropolitan area of Mexico City. So we need to maintain public transport users there. Also, some behaviors that have appeared with the COVID pandemic, and this is related to the division and also to freight transport. And this is also linked to the opportunity to give more potential to bicycles, but also shared with motorbikes. And this is a challenge because given the way in which road users share it, well, this is very important because we need to take into account the current situation of the city. And this is important given what is happening with public transport.
So I think this is a very important thing in terms of modal share to reduce the users of public transport with all the challenges that we have in economic infrastructure, so that we can maintain public transport and do not migrate to private transport, motorcycles, for example. Thank you. Thank you, Alvaro. I think that in Mexico City, we have not seen that transition towards motorcycle that we can see in other Latin American cities, and that have its challenges and disadvantages. I would like to hear Oscar Vázquez now. He will tell us a little bit about his opinion on what he thinks in a post-COVID times. What are the realistic conditions that you think we could leverage to reach the goals that have been set to achieve in terms of climate change and reduction of GHG? And also, what are the main barriers that could be found? You have the floor, Oscar. Thank you very much, everyone. I would like to not repeat myself because my colleagues are experts and I don't want to get into their topics. But from the environment perspective, I think that in this COVID times and post-COVID times, it will be strategic to make the most of these situations so that we can enhance and empower all the changes towards a low emission mobility. It is essential to move forward in reducing our carbon footprint and the pollutants that we breathe here. I will not go deep into it now, but there are some barriers that I do want to mention, and I would like to emphasize particularly two of them. In our country, we have a large interconnected power system, electric system, and electrification will impact, have a serious impact in the stability of electrical systems. There is a system that is heavily loaded in the central Mexican Valley area with a high power demand. And this really destabilizes the system. So something should be done. We should talk to the power generators and the systems that control this distribution of power, of electrical power, so that we could have realistic electrification scenarios for the next few decades, considering the fact that the typical power plant construction times are 4 years or more. So we should be one step ahead. That's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is funding. We know that there are resources in the world. We know that there are technologies available. We know that there is an intention to move resources and technologies. However, the funding conditions for structural changes that we need are not always the best. Summing up, we face interest commercial rates that hugely affect the financial feasibility of projects, which in many cases become a barrier. However, free money does not exist. So we should have to work in very strategic systems. We should have to work in counterpart guarantees, equity, and those kind of things that would make it possible for us to act strategically in these funding sources that make it possible for us to develop projects. And many of those projects will be based on new technologies. So I think that our colleagues in other cities and even in the city of Mexico have certain experiences in managing new systems, but I think that we need to particularly emphasize these things. The final element that I would like to mention, let's bet on the young people. The young people are currently doing many things that most of us would not do. For example, ride sharing. For example, different means of mobility. So I think that it's important to place a bet on the youth. There's a generational change in terms of the mobility vision. We need to make the most of it. And in the case of Mexico City, I think that The fact that we have implemented our first BRT line, our Metrobus, in the financial corridor of the city, that is Avenida Insurgentes. It is a very visible location with high level, great jobs, and this created expectations in the rest of the city. So these strategies, having social impacts in aspirational areas, the fact that people see that it works there so that we can later then implement that in other places of the city, that's a good strategy. It's not the only one, but it is a strategy that has been fruitful here and that can help us move forward in terms of working with young people and becoming aspirational. So thank you.
Yes, electricity is complex and we need to see this for the long term. And I would like to highlight what you said about young people, and I think that's very important. And in the US a couple of years ago, it was the first year that car sales figures stopped going up. And why? Because many of the young people there are no longer interested in buying a car as soon as they can. So that mindset is changing. So we'll need to work on younger populations also to see how we can increase the use of public transportation, how we can offer better mobility options, because young people are actually the future of transport. Now I would like to hear from Bernardo. You've heard the vision of the Secretariat of Mobility. We've heard from the Secretariat of Environment, but you, Bernardo, not from the institutional sphere, what can you say about these conditions in Mexico City in order to fulfill the decarbonizing goals, and what do you consider the main obstacles? Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I think that very interesting points have been mentioned today. I think that considering the framework of references that have been used for a long time, avoid, shift, and improve, that's still valid. In this case, it is very important, this avoid, shift, and improve. These are still valid options. And I believe that maybe the easiest thing would be to start with improving, improving the vehicles, the technologies, the performance, of course, electrification. I think that this is not moving forward as fast as it would like to. There are financial issues that were mentioned, but I believe that there we will see in the next years an important growth. Now, of course, that's not easy, but I think that it is relatively simpler at least. Now, in terms of shifting people or changing people, or as Rodrigo said, maintaining the proportions in terms of modes, I think that there are several factors there. Of course, quality of public transport, and I think that we should aspire to a multimodal city, because I think that that would be the way in which people won't be migrating to private cars as soon as they can. And also, after the pandemic, there was a boom of the active mobility. For example, the bike lane initiative, I believe, was fantastic because it shows that we can divide space differently, and this would attract new users for those protected areas. So I believe that those are the type of initiatives that will have good results after the pandemic. However, the first point in terms of how to avoid or shorten trips, well, that's hard because That's where we found the higher number of obstacles. And that's related to the fact that we have not been able to articulate urban development well with transport system. As we know, in Mexico City, most of the jobs happen in the area of Reforma and Insurgentes, and people don't live there, because we then need to find a way to take good public transport to other areas that are consolidated also in peripheries. So I believe then that that is the great challenge in order to shorten trips or to avoid trips. And of course, telework will help, but it should be accompanied by a much more holistic policy related to urban development, and also with managing better the private car trips and trying to have a more aggressive demand management in order to reduce parking areas, and also having better schemes. I think that is my perspective. Thank you, Bernardo. And now, with the questions that we have for the panel, and maybe shifting a little bit the order. Bernardo, do you think that it is possible to achieve a zero emission transport system for 2050 in Mexico City? Well, I do believe so, yes. Given the speed that things are moving forward, I think it's achievable. However, we need to have success cases. We need to carry out pilots that could be then replicated. And we need more coordination, because one thing is Mexico City and a different thing is the state of Mexico. So there are so many challenges, but I do believe we can achieve that, and we should do it. It's actually our responsibility for the next generations. Thank you. Oscar, same question, and now considering your energy perspective, which is part of your specialization, do you think that we could have a zero emission system by 2050 in Mexico City? Well, we should do it. We should achieve it. And whether there are problems or bottlenecks, we need to solve them. There are no other options. Nature is giving us signs that we are not dominating it, and we still need to do a lot to dominate it. And actually, the pandemic has shown the effect of viruses, but it's not the only thing. And the scientific community is talking about climate change impacts and things that many people don't believe, like contamination being so damaging, and there is scientific proof of that. So we have no choice. We need to move towards a zero emission scenario, or very close to zero, and maybe compensating it with other activities that also exist, so that net emissions could be zero. And throughout, along the way, we need to solve the problems that might arise. For example, in terms of the electric network, if there are funding problems, we need to find a way and solve them. There are no other possible choice, not for Mexico City or for the humanity. That's my perspective. Thank you, Oscar. Alvaro, we have very positive positions for the zero emission goal in the transport system, in the public transport system in Mexico City by 2050. What's your view? Well, mainly I believe that all the scenarios built in this model were quite realistic. They were not optimistic. They are all linked to our demographic reality, our financial reality, and the social-spatial reality, and also not only in the city, but in the metropolis. And even though Mexico City has been dropping in number of population, and actually there is an inertia because we see a different number of trips by 2040, but after 2040, the number will drop, but what we see is that the number of vehicles on the fleets will be increasing. And in this case, it's not only changing, but also extending. So this is the way in which we have built the scenarios. We've always discussed with Dimitri and Elizabeth the scenario that should start from a structural reality, both for the population and the current transport in the city. And that is why the baseline scenario chose these conditions. We need to say so. And we've discussed this actually for the next 5 years, which is a time frame where we would know much more about the new projects, which are also linked to this unequal situation taking place in the city. So the 5 years was a much accurate time frame. 23 years was a little bit more complicated to forecast. However, we did do some assumptions, very mild assumptions, because there is an inertia, as I say, a financial and demographic inertia that presents us with challenges. And I don't think that it will be easy to overcome them, especially given the political situation of the metropole. But I think that we are in that direction, not only in terms of fleet, but also with other strategies, much more integral, including soil technology, regardless of transport, that could take us to our ultimate goal, which is to reduce emissions, and not only having a clean fleet, but also reducing general emissions. Thank you, Alvaro. And we have a question from the public that maybe will be for Rodrigo. Rodrigo, the audience is asking, could you please tell us a little bit about the future of electric vehicles in Mexico City? Well, this is actually related to the previous question. I believe that even if we don't do anything, 2050 will see a total fleet of electric cars. I mean, I cannot think that we will still be selling fleet with fossil fuels by 2050, regardless of the path to follow. And mainly because car manufacturers, most of them have announced that they will stop producing fuel or diesel cars by 2030 or 2035. So I think that by 2050, all the vehicles sold will be zero emissions. The problem, however, will be related to what was sold before that. So when will the last car or the last bus using diesel or fuel will be sold? And that is where we need to move faster, because we live in a city where we have a fleet of around 5,000 microbuses that are more than 30 years old. And we always say, this is the last year, this is last year, and we'll stop. But then the question is, we have two things here. One is that we could be okay, because that I think that by 2040, probably all the units that will be sold will be electric. But we need to hurry, because what it's being sold today will last 10 years or maybe 15 or 20, like we see now in the city. If we buy diesel technologies today, this means that we will have diesel buses probably up to 2040. If we do not change our organization and financial methods. That is the hot topic if we do not change now. And this is why we need to hurry up, because the private vehicle fleet and the public transport and freight transport fleets are usually older than in developed countries. Therefore, that's our hurry, not so much related to whether they're going to be sold or not. The problem that we'll have to face is this delay that we are going to be having with these old vehicles still in use. Thank you, Rodrigo. Great point in terms of the vehicles that are being sold now, and with a long life cycle, they're going to be still there by 2030. Now, I would like to ask the next question to Oscar. And I would like to know what international actions could help us make sure that the relevant actions or actions to fight climate change could become a reality in Mexico City. From the environmental perspective, do you think there are any international actions that could be helpful with this? Because we have discussed a lot about funding. Oscar, you also raised a very interesting point in terms of the green bonds. So what other actions, whether, I don't know, knowledge transfer or other types of cooperation beyond funding issues? Yes, I could summarize this saying that every action, everything will help, everything will contribute if it is adopted in the right way, in a strategic way. International cooperation could be very helpful, for example, with technical assistance, helping us knowing the experiences of other similar cities similar to Mexico City, knowing the lessons learned, success cases, and in turn, we could also share our success cases. We also have our lessons learned, of course, but this knowledge exchange would be fantastic. And also, yesterday, we talked about, I don't remember the exact words, but maybe given the status quo, could answer you back very strongly. So I believe that international support is very good because it shows how initiatives are performed with technical quality, financial analysis, including social issues, gender issues, etc., etc. Therefore, I believe that there is also a strategic participation from the international point of view that could have a very positive impact in many of our initiatives. Thank you. Thank you, Oscar. We have one more question in the chat, and I think that maybe this could be for Dimitris or for Elizabeth or someone from the ITF. And the question is the following. Dimitris.
Question that it's being posed by the audience, and it says, is passengers electromobility enough to reach 0% CO2 emissions target by 2050 in Mexico City?
Hold on, let me pull this up so I can see it.
So, if you can see the question, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So definitely not. I mean, when we're talking about transport emissions do not come only from passengers, they also come from freight movements. However, there are examples, and I think Mexico City has some good examples on how freight movements at an urban setting can be electrified, and they can lead to 0% emissions, at least from that specific operations. So it is important to take into account the different aspects, passenger transport, the different variety of measures that we can take, both on passenger and on freight. Now, of course, at the ITF in general, we do have a lot of studies, a lot of projects that focus on freight. This was not one of them, but still, we do think that the future of the cities, especially of freight movement in the cities, has a big potential with electromobility. We believe that the other green energy sources could be used, but they would be more likely used in intercity movements, because when you're looking at the city movements, electric vehicles should be something that can cover the needs of freight movements. I do not know if someone else, Elizabeth or Stephen, want to add something on that.
Yeah, if you take over the chairing, I'd just like to add from a broader point of view that, yeah, no, you're right, no way will electrification do it all. We do need to, as Bernardo said and Rodrigo said, get control of demand, both from the planning system and also from the instruments we use to manage traffic and manage demand for cars and motorcycles. And I wouldn't put it quite the way we did on the slides as penalizing car use, more managing it in the most efficient way. And I think that's also required to get us to the levels of CO2 emission quickly enough and keep us there.
Thank you, Steve. Estamos acercándonos al final y estamos ya casi en la hora. Voy a hacer
We're almost on time. We've run out of time, but I will ask a final question to wrap up, perhaps for Álvaro and Rodrigo, and for Álvaro and Oscar as well. Is there any kind of specific support from the IADB or ITF that could be provided from them to keep supporting your initiatives in the City of Mexico? Well, it's what we talked about yesterday. It is always necessary to have funding or financial support for these infrastructures, particularly when the post-COVID economy has been hampered and damaged. It's important to have multilateral contacts with other cities which have specific realities. Apart from what we have here, we have informally developed contacts with Buenos Aires, with Bogotá. We have shared experiences in many other initiatives. So getting to know them directly, having this direct contact with the people who have implemented these solutions helps us assess and know how and see how we adapt those things to our reality. Of course, that is very useful for us. And you have to excuse me, I am needed in another forum, so I have to sign off. Thank you. Goodbye. Hopefully, I will see you soon face to face and no longer via Zoom. But thank you so much. Bye-bye. I have to go. Thank you, Rodrigo. I am aware of the fact that probably all of the participants can have other commitments already. And as Rodrigo mentioned, this might be a new stage of continuous collaboration. Elizabeth mentioned this as well, and we'll soon see the published reports and everything will be documented. And it's not like I don't want to think about this, but this does not finish with reports. We will continue to have an exchange, and us from the IADB, we will continue to find other kinds of collaboration efforts with ITF or maybe other cities in Mexico, or to continue, as Alvaro or Rodrigo said, to expand this scope to include the state of Mexico and to improve some measurements and scenarios. I don't know if anyone else from the team want to add something. We are 2 minutes past our deadline, so I would like to just make an advertisement. We will continue tomorrow and on Friday with similar sessions regarding Bogotá and Buenos Aires. We have the same links for you to join, so thank you so very much.